The moment that would later be described as a turning point in Judge Frank Caprio's career began quietly, but quickly escalated on a January Tuesday morning. Long before the case was called, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. Federal agents arrived first. Security procedures intensified. Metal detectors, scanning equipment, and trained dogs transformed the room into something closer to a secured facility than a municipal court. When the doors finally opened, the reason became clear. A 19-year-old college student entered under heavy protection. Barron Trump, the youngest son of former U.S. President Donald Trump, stood well over 6 feet tall, drawing immediate attention simply by his presence. He had recently begun college life in New York and arrived surrounded by layers of security and legal representation. Secret Service agents, multiple attorneys, and staff members carrying expensive briefcases. Everything about his appearance reflected privilege, influence, and insulation from ordinary consequences. Observers noted his demeanor. Calm, confident, almost dismissive. It was the posture of someone who seemed certain the outcome had already been decided in his favor. But the real gravity of the case became clear when attention shifted to the front row of the gallery. There sat David Martinez, a 52-year-old high school teacher and father of 2. He arrived without protection, without legal power, and without influence. His appearance told its own story. Fading facial bruises, damaged glasses held together with tape, and the visible anxiety of someone who had already been hurt once and feared being silenced again. According to police records and surveillance footage, the incident that brought both men into the courtroom occurred 2 weeks earlier at a downtown nightclub restricted to patrons over 21. Investigators determined that the younger man had gained entry using false identification. Martinez had been attending a colleague's retirement gathering when the two accidentally collided in the crowded venue. What should have ended with an apology escalated instead. Reports stated that Martinez was grabbed, shoved into a wall, followed when he attempted to leave, and knocked to the floor. Witnesses confirmed that the confrontation did not end there. Statements allegedly invoking family power and political influence were made, words that suggested retaliation and intimidation rather than remorse. Security cameras recorded the entire encounter. The charges were serious: assault and battery, underage drinking, use of false identification, and witness intimidation. Now, both individuals stood on opposite sides of the justice system, one backed by influence and legacy, the other relying solely on the law for protection. From the bench, Judge Caprio did not see a political name or a powerful family. He saw a case that tested the integrity of the courtroom itself. What followed during the proceedings would later be discussed far beyond that building, not because of who stood accused, but because of the question the case forced into the open. Does privilege alter accountability, or does the law remain the law, regardless of lineage? That morning, the courtroom became more than a place of judgment. It became a measure of whether justice could stand firm when power expected it to bend. The case would later be remembered as proof that when the justice system functions as it should, influence alone cannot rewrite the rules. No surname, no political legacy, and no security detail is supposed to place someone beyond accountability. As the proceedings moved forward, the tension inside the courtroom was unmistakable. Everyone understood what was at stake. Not just the outcome of one case, but the principle behind it. Judge Caprio formally outlined the charges: assault and battery, underage drinking, possession of false identification, and witness intimidation. Before addressing any plea, however, he turned his attention to the unusually heavy security presence filling the room. He asked the defense to explain why federal agents were stationed throughout a municipal courtroom. The lead attorney, a high-profile former government official, calmly cited federal statutes that allow Secret Service protection for children of former presidents. The judge listened, then pointedly noted that the defendant was 19 years old, legally an adult, and asked why those protections still applied in a criminal proceeding. The response emphasized that the protection had not been declined and referenced unspecified security concerns. The judge glanced toward the gallery, then back toward the bench, making it clear that vague justifications would not replace transparency in a courtroom. When the defendant was asked to enter a plea, he stood with visible confidence. He denied the charges and claimed he was being singled out because of his family name. He insisted the incident began with provocation and framed his actions as self-defense, minimizing the seriousness of what had occurred. The judge addressed him directly, calmly, but firmly. He reminded him that being underage in a restricted venue, using false identification, and engaging in physical violence were not matters of interpretation. They were facts under the law. Rather than showing restraint, the defendant dismissed the use of a fake ID as normal college behavior and suggested the nightclub may have allowed him entry because of who he was. That admission only deepened the court's concern. At that point, the prosecution presented surveillance footage. The video showed the defendant entering the nightclub with friends, handing over identification that was accepted without proper scrutiny. Inside, the footage captured the crowded environment, the accidental contact near the bar, and the immediate escalation that followed. What appeared to be a brief, unintentional bump quickly turned into a physical confrontation. The recording showed the older man attempting to disengage, only to be followed, shoved, and knocked to the floor. The audio captured statements invoking family power and threatening professional consequences. Additional footage showed resistance when officers arrived, including claims that arrest was not permitted due to family status. When the video ended, the courtroom remained silent. Judge Caprio addressed the defendant again, summarizing what had just been shown: unlawful entry, physical assault without provocation, and explicit intimidation using political influence. He asked a simple question: whether the defendant still believed his actions were justified. The defense attempted to reframe the events as youthful mistakes and mutual confrontation, arguing that similar behavior often results in minor penalties. They also suggested heightened sensitivity due to security concerns. The judge rejected that reasoning. He made it clear that fear does not excuse violence, privilege does not excuse threats, and political lineage does not excuse criminal conduct. He then asked the victim to approach the bench. The teacher stepped forward quietly. His posture, his voice, and his restraint reflected someone accustomed to de-escalation, not confrontation. As he began to speak, the courtroom shifted again, this time from tension to focus. What followed would not be about politics or power. It would be about facts, responsibility, and whether the law applied equally to everyone who stood before it. The teacher stood before the court and introduced himself calmly. He explained that he had spent more than 2 decades teaching history at a public high school, educating students about democracy, constitutional limits, and the rule of law. That night, he said, he had attended a small retirement gathering for a colleague, an uncommon outing for someone juggling family responsibilities and tight finances. As he described the incident, his voice grew steadier, not angry, but deeply affected. While carrying drinks through the crowded nightclub, he accidentally brushed against another patron. He immediately apologized and attempted to move away. Instead, he was grabbed by the collar and forcefully shoved into a wall. He explained that he tried again to disengage, emphasizing that he was not a confrontational person. He was in his 50s, not a fighter, and relied on his glasses to see clearly. Those glasses were knocked from his face. Moments later, he was pushed to the ground, hitting his head on the floor. But physical pain, he said, was not what stayed with him. What frightened him most were the words spoken afterward. Claims that political power could erase his career with a single phone call, that status mattered more than law, and that ordinary people should know their place. Tears welled as he explained the contradiction he now faced. A history teacher explaining checks and balances to students while being told they did not apply in real life. After the incident, the pressure did not stop. Anonymous calls followed. Warnings. Suggestions that continuing the case would destroy his career. One message implied that educators were expendable, while powerful names were not. Each call reinforced the same message: silence yourself or suffer consequences. He looked directly toward the defendant and explained why he refused to withdraw. If he abandoned the case out of fear, he said, he would no longer be able to teach his students honestly. He would no longer be able to stand in front of a classroom and say that justice applies equally to everyone. The courtroom fell silent. The judge noticed that the defendant appeared disengaged, focused on his phone rather than the testimony being given. He ordered the device put away and reminded him that he was listening to the person he had harmed. When asked to respond, the defense declined to offer a statement. The prosecution then introduced recorded evidence. 2 phone calls were played. Each carried the same message: drop the charges or face professional ruin. The tone was calm, calculated, and unmistakably coercive. Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge addressed the defense directly, asking whether anyone connected to the defendant had authorized or encouraged those calls. The response was a denial, attributing the threats to unidentified supporters. The judge made clear that the origin did not change the impact. An attempt to intimidate a witness had occurred. He then instructed the defendant to stand. The judge summarized the findings clearly and without theatrics. The evidence showed unlawful entry using false identification, illegal alcohol consumption, unprovoked physical assault, and explicit threats invoking political influence. Each charge was supported by video, audio, and testimony. The verdict was delivered plainly. Guilty. The defendant reacted emotionally, accusing the court of political motivation. The judge stopped him immediately, stating that the ruling had nothing to do with family, ideology, or public status. It was about conduct, evidence, and the law. Sentencing followed. Incarceration for assault. Additional time for witness intimidation carried out through implied political retaliation. Further penalties for identity fraud and underage drinking. Consecutive sentences. Real consequences. The courtroom erupted, not in celebration, but in shock. A clear line had been drawn. When the room finally quieted, the message was unmistakable. In a functioning system, power does not erase responsibility. Threats do not replace truth. And justice does not bend simply because a name carries weight. As the sentence was announced, movement rippled through the courtroom. Secret Service agents instinctively stepped forward, their training taking over. Defense counsel reacted immediately, arguing loudly that the punishment was excessive for a 19-year-old college student and insisting the ruling was driven by political hostility. Appeals were promised on the spot. Judge Frank Caprio did not raise his voice. He responded evenly, stating that the sentence reflected the facts, not politics. The defendant had assaulted a teacher, invoked political power to intimidate a witness, and displayed no accountability for his actions. Age and privilege, the judge explained, were not shields from responsibility, especially when entitlement itself had fueled the misconduct. The defendant reacted with visible anger, insisting that incarceration would ruin his future and invoking his family once again. Judge Caprio interrupted firmly. He clarified that the defendant's father was a private citizen with no authority in that courtroom. Influence, legacy, and status held no weight there. Only evidence and law did. The court then ordered full restitution to the victim, covering medical expenses, replacement of damaged property, and compensation for harm suffered. A protective order followed, strictly prohibiting any contact, direct or indirect, between the defendant, his family, or associates and the victim. Judge Caprio addressed the defendant directly, his tone measured but unmistakably serious. Growing up in proximity to power, he said, was not an achievement but a circumstance of birth. Privilege carried responsibility, not exemption. Using a famous name as a tool for intimidation, exploiting perceived immunity, and treating others as expendable were choices, and those choices had consequences. He reminded the courtroom that the United States does not recognize inherited immunity. There are no titles, no family lines, and no surnames that place a person above the law. In that courtroom, the defendant was not a symbol or a legacy. He was an adult who committed crimes and was being held accountable. The gavel came down. As officers moved in, the defendant continued to protest, invoking appeals and outside influence. Judge Caprio warned that further threats would result in additional charges. The bailiff then took the defendant into custody. He was led away in handcuffs, disbelief and anger still evident. Within hours, the case became national news. Public reactions were polarized, and criticism followed. But weeks later, the Rhode Island Supreme Court unanimously upheld Judge Caprio's ruling. In its written opinion, the court stated that being related to a former president does not diminish criminal responsibility and that the sentence was justified given the use of perceived political power to intimidate a victim in the absence of remorse. The defendant ultimately served a reduced term due to good behavior. The victim received restitution and returned to his classroom, continuing to teach civic principles, not as theory, but as lived experience. The case became a lasting reminder of a core democratic principle. Power does not replace law. Influence does not erase accountability. And justice loses meaning the moment exceptions are made for famous names. Judge Frank Caprio did not sentence a legacy. He sentenced conduct. An own name puts you above the law. No power erases accountability. In Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, justice answers to facts, not families.